Hello and welcome to Heroes Remembered. This is the first episode of some of the fascinating stories of Kilmallock that have been lost and forgotten over time. It's our wish to change that. This first story is that of travelling salesman Jeremiah O'Callaghan. Our first story brings us to the former train station of Kilmallock. It's now in a pretty sad and derelict state, but once it was a bustling place. Travellers came and went, freight was unloaded, and this was the golden age of steam-powered trains. In the year of 1892, the 30th of September, a packed platform of evening travellers couldn't have imagined the horror that was about to take place.
Built in 1849, this train station, like many others across the country, amongst thousands of lines of track, was the beating heart of the town's economy. Passengers would have came and went, freight unloaded. This now derelict ruin sets the scene for the beginning of our story here in Kilmallock.
On the platform, waiting for the 6:15 train to Cork, stood two men, both travelling salesmen. One was Mr. John Barrett and the other was Jeremiah O'Callaghan. Both men were frequent travellers and visitors to Kilmallock. Whilst across the tracks, just after purchasing her ticket, was an elderly apple seller from Charleville, Annie Ryan.
Annie was notoriously laid back and always took her time, and the station master made sure to hurry her along as the train was about to arrive. Now, the standard safety procedures at this time, especially for night trains, was that the gate to the level crossing just behind me would be closed. Torches lit and whistles blown to let the travellers know that their train was arriving. Unfortunately, due to reasons never fully explained at the inquest, these procedures weren't followed.
Annie slowly made her way across. This night was dark, gas lamps had not been lit, and as Annie was quite deaf, she was unaware and could not hear that the train was steaming towards her. As fellow travellers on the platform noticed the danger she was in, they tried to shout at her, telling her to step back, but tragically, she couldn't hear their pleas. It's now that one of our salesmen takes centre stage. Jeremiah O'Callaghan, in an act of outstanding courage and bravery, leapt off the platform and tried to push Annie out of the way. She fell forwards onto the track, O'Callaghan flying past her onto the opposite. It's here, at this very moment, that he made a fateful decision. With Annie now surely doomed, he reached forward again to pull her out of the way. It's this decision, to set aside his own safety, that led to his end. The train smashed into both of them, instantly killing Annie Ryan. O'Callaghan, struck on the side of the head, was thrown backwards. Almost immediately attended by the station staff and a local doctor who happened to be on board. With a shattered skull, he clung to life for 10 minutes, bleeding profusely, before finally passing away without a word. An inquest into the accident itself cleared the station staff and train driver of any blame. The days following the death of Jeremiah O'Callaghan and Annie Ryan generated huge interest in the national press. One of the final articles written in the Cork Examiner, dated to the 4th of October, finishes with the words, "Released from sorrow, sin and pain, and free from every care, by angel's hand to heaven sent, to rest forever there." Finally, Jeremiah O'Callaghan was brought home to his native Cork to be laid to rest. And it's here in St. Joseph's Cemetery that I've come to meet local historian Ronnie Herlihy, who's written a book on the cemetery itself and knows the story very well.
Well, from all that we've read about him from the time of his death, which is the only thing we have, he was a man who was very self-sacrificing, and he gave the ultimate sacrifice to try and save somebody else's life. That's about all we know from the reports at the time. So he was probably quite an unassuming guy, just a regular man going about his daily work and had finished for the day and was just coming home and ended up in a very tragic situation. Well, it really struck a chord with people. You have to remember the time it happened, the Victorian era. It was an era when people really put a strong emphasis on bravery and chivalry and all that went with it. And when this man gave his life in attempting to save somebody else, it really, as I said, it brought out the best in people, not just here in Cork, but around the country. So much so that up to £1,000 was raised very quickly from all over the country to have this beautiful monument erected over his grave. The grave of a man who really was literally unknown before his death. Well, the whole of civic authority kind of got behind it here in Cork City in particular, with the, as you say, the mayor and all the aldermen and councillors, and indeed his friends and his work colleagues in Dwyer's, the company he worked in, which was a big firm on Washington Street here in Cork City. And they started the ball rolling, and the salesmen from that in particular, and his bosses, his employers, gave a lot of money towards it. So it went as far afield as some very interesting names, the likes of William Smith O'Brien, who sent down money as well for this. So as I say, it wasn't just a local story, it really went around to various parts of the country. When the story got out, and the story in particular of how he gave up his life, it struck that chord with people, as I say, and money came in from all over the country for this monument. It was a huge event. It was very untypical of the funeral that this man would have expected had he died a natural death, let's say. In particular, the funeral cortege and the route that it took, because he was living quite close to the cemetery, within a couple of 100 yards literally from where he's buried was the house he lived in, and the local church, the South Chapel, was where he was buried from, and that would have been, if you were coming from there, South Chapel, out to St. Joseph's Cemetery, you took a very short route. It was the A to B in the quickest route possible, but instead his funeral was brought all through the city, which was way out of the way. It wasn't in the direction of the cemetery at all. So he was given a kind of a hero's funeral, a funeral that was reserved for the so-called great and the good of society. When his funeral, his coffin was processed all through the city, all through the main streets of the city, and the stores, the various department stores and small shops, all shut while the funeral cortege passed. So it was a huge and very moving ceremony for this very regular man. I suppose important is a word that's very kind of loosely put these days, but I suppose there's some well-known people. The best known would be the man that opened the cemetery itself, Father Matthew. He's probably the best known figure nationally here in Ireland that will be buried in St. Joseph's Cemetery. But there are very many local people who would have been well known, particularly throughout the 19th century. Big businessmen, big politicians and stuff that wouldn't be generally on the radar of people today. They were very well known in their own day. The likes of John Francis Maguire, who founded the Cork Examiner newspaper, among other businesses. And of course the likes of Cathy Barry, the great Cathy Barry, this legendary woman of Cork, is buried just not far from us here. And to my right, and just behind me, is one of Cork's greatest actors, a man called Edward Mulhare, who again grew up just a short distance away from the cemetery. And he had a career that spanned something like 6 decades, up to the time of his death in 1997. So there's a whole range of people buried here, and in particular it's the burial place of many of the Cork Fenians. There was a place where the Manchester Martyrs commemorations came out to, the processions came out here to St. Joseph's for most of the time after they began in the 19th century. Up until the 20th century the focus was St. Joseph. So you have, like any big cemetery or graveyard, you have a whole range of people, from the people who are unknown at all to the as I said, the great and the good of society. I suppose when you say does it tell the story, it literally tells the story on the monument itself. It's what drew my attention to the monument when I was out here wandering around looking at the headstone. So you can see from the inscription what actually occurred. But the sheer scale of the monument, it is one of the largest in the cemetery. And for a man who was, as I say, totally unknown before his death, it's something that he could never have expected, and his family would never probably have been able to afford. And it was due to public subscription, as I said. It was members of the public, for the most part, that gave up a few shillings or a pound or two, that drove the subscription up up to nearly £1,000 before this monument was carved by one of the well-known Cork stone cutters or sculptors at the time, a man called John Francis Davis.
So there you go, the forgotten story of a hero named Jeremiah O'Callaghan. This is the first in what we hope will be a short series on stories hidden in history. There's still a lot more tales to tell. Thanks for watching.